Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 8 of my series on the Mexican Revolution, the Convention at Aguascalientes. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Victoriano Huerta's coup had provoked more resistance than expected. Zapata had become an experienced guerrilla, but the key threat was in the north, where Venustiano Carranza's constitutionalist party had solid roots and a skilled general, Alvaro Obregon. Moreover, Pancho Villa had forged several bands of guerrillas into a genuine army. Worse, President Woodrow Wilson had seized a very flimsy excuse to occupy the crucial port of Veracruz in order to pressure the various factions to come to their senses and follow his guidance regarding the replacement of Heurta. To his surprise, the invasion of Mexican territory was resented by each faction. A feud between Carranza and Villa, caused by Villa's refusal to recognize Carranza as leader of the revolution, delayed Huerta's defeat, but he finally resigned on July 15, 1914, and fled to exile in Spain. After reaching Mexico City on August 20th, Carranza immediately replaced the Federal Army with the Constitutionalist Army. Federal officers were prohibited from enlisting in the new army, so many senior officers left the country, further swelling the ranks of exiles scheming to return to power. In fact, thousands of rich Mexicans, Spaniards, and Catholic clergy made their way to Veracruz and exile. Aside from the rivalry between Carranza and Villa, other internal conflicts within the constitutionalist movement had been suppressed in order to focus on the struggle against Huerta. Well, the dictator had been defeated, so Carranza decided to weaken a potential rival by appointing someone else to replace Obregón as commander of the Division of the Northwest. He then appointed Obregón's nephew Benjamin Gil provisional governor of Sonora, even though the official governor, José Maturana, was a former supporter of Madero and still had a year left in his term. Gil was supported by a senior military commander, Plutarco Elias Calles, who had his own ambitions. The game of political musical chairs is a bit complicated, but Carranza appeared to have successfully isolated Obregón from his power base in Sonora. Overwhelmed by the threat of Gil and Calles backed by Carranza, Maturana sought support from the only real rival to Carranza, Pancho Villa. Seeing himself slipping towards irrelevance, Obregón took the risk of traveling to Villa's HQ with only a few guards on August 24th. Despite earlier pledges of support, Villa happily sacrificed Maturana when Obregón made a better offer. The two men worked out an arrangement where Gil and Calles would serve under Maturana, who would become commander of the military forces in Sonora, while the more radical Sonoran General Juan Cabral would become governor. Oh, and Carranza would become interim president, which would disqualify him from serving a full term as president, conveniently leaving the presidential chair empty for someone else, preferably someone named Alvaro Obregon. The deal would have transformed the situation in Mexico, but basically, everyone involved rejected the deal. Instead, the conflict between Maturana and Gil and Calles managed to intensify. Aware that Villa would not react favorably to the news that he had failed to deliver his part of the bargain, Obregón rashly returned to Chihuahua, hoping to persuade Villa to sacrifice Maturana anyway. This risky strategy produced predictable results. Villa threatened to put him in front of a firing squad, but his saner advisors Raúl Madero and Felipe Ángeles pressed for Obregón to be spared, otherwise the revolution would become even more complex and bloody. Obregón thought that the matter of his execution had been settled, but Villa had concluded that the short-term strife was worth the long-term problems that would be caused if Obregón wanted to become president, so he decided to have him executed. However, other generals agreed with Madero and Ángeles, so they arranged for Obregón to swiftly exit Villa's territory. While it appeared that disaster had been avoided, any hope for smooth cooperation between Villa and Obregon in the future had disappeared, since Obregon would never forget that Villa had attempted to have him executed. Since Americans owned the richest plantations, mines, and oil wells, but had previously paid token royalties, popular anger at foreign exploitation drove Carranza and his generals to renegotiate those royalty agreements. Despite his laudable defense of Mexican sovereignty, he was less concerned by the exploitation of poor Mexicans by rich Mexicans. Carranza returned most captured haciendas to their original owners because food production was vital, and he felt that only hacendados, not peasants, could arrange it, and he did not believe in land reform anyway. Naturally, this approach ensured conflict with Zapata, but Carranza dismissed him as a peasant and made little effort to form an alliance with him. Suspicious of anyone from Mexico City, Zapata would not negotiate unless Carranza promised free elections and confirmation of the Plan of Ayala. Meetings between Carranza's envoys and Zapata did not go well, and Carranza announced on September 5th that he would not accept Zapata's terms. 3 days later, Zapata responded by appropriating all of the hacienda's land for the villages. Not every agrarian reformer chose such a confrontational approach. Instead, some preferred to work with Carranza. When Heurta fled into exile, constitutionalist troops occupied San Luis Potosi, supported by the Cedillo family. After squashing any resistance in the state and nearby Puebla and Veracruz, the Cedillos and their allies established a provisional government to maintain order with Eulalio Gutierrez as provisional governor. Gutierrez closed religious schools, allowed the establishment of a union, set a minimum wage for miners and agricultural laborers, and mandated a 9-hour workday. Unlike Zapata, the friction between Villa and Carranza was largely personal, and part of the age-old struggle of regional strongmen to resist central control. The only reason why the open break between Carranza and Villa did not immediately lead to war was that everyone else was tired of fighting. Convinced that only he, not a squabbling assembly of debaters, had the responsibility to govern the nation, Carranza held a convention in Mexico City on October 1st that was attended by only his most loyal supporters, but everyone, except for Carranza, knew that it was meaningless unless other factions attended. Led by Lucio Blanco, one of Obregon's top generals and a leader of northeastern Mexico, 49 of Carranza's generals contacted Villa's division to suggest negotiations to resolve the differences between the factions. Carranza was furious but powerless to prevent the organization of a convention at Aguascalientes, where the only delegates were military men and the number of delegates was determined by the size of each faction's army. While the decision to only invite military leaders does not sound very democratic, it was a very realistic admission that stability depended on reconciling the various independent armies. Also, the military leaders did not want a repeat of Madero's triumph, where the civilian leaders had enjoyed the fruits of victory and the generals were told to go home. Since most of those civilian leaders had bent the knee to Heurta, the generals understandably felt that civilian leaders no longer had any legitimacy. Even so, many generals sent newly commissioned civilian advisors as their representatives. So, if not Carranza, who were the other options for president? Villa sent 39 delegates led by Roque González Garza and Ángeles. Villa had few ideological demands and mainly wanted autonomy in the north. Villa's supporters were genuinely willing to compromise to avoid war, and would even accept a Carranza supporter as president, just not Carranza himself. Carranza's delegates were much fewer, but many had been appointed governor by him, so they were loyal and reluctant to see widespread change that would take away their newfound privileges. They also had few ideological demands, but did not offer compromise, just to demand that everyone submit to Carranza's authority. The remaining delegates were not allied to either man, but they held the balance of power. What about the Zapatistas, you ask? General Lucio Blanco spent much time persuading Zapata to attend the convention, and Felipe Ángeles traveled to Morelos to extend a personal invitation. Since Ángeles had been trying to kill Zapata the last time he was in Morelos, He must have been relieved that Zapata welcomed him with open arms, not a firing squad. The invitation was successful and Zapata sent 26 delegates, but they would not be able to vote until the convention recognized the Plan of Ayala. Villa's envoys wooed Zapata's envoys, but since neither of the great men actually took part in the convention, the star was Obregon, who appeared at the convention full of confidence and charm. The support of Villa's envoys ensured that most of Zapata's Plan of Ayala was accepted, while the assembly voted 112 to 21 to remove Carranza. However, Obregón gained the most by ensuring the election of Eulalio Gutierrez of San Luis Potosi, a minor regional leader, as provisional president. The hope was that Gutierrez's new government would include representatives from the various factions and thus avoid a civil war. That hope was soon destroyed. After Carranza refused to recognize the result of the convention and surrender authority to Gutierrez, he was declared a rebel on November 10th. Delegates from different factions began organizing their followers for war, but Villa became impatient and sent 30,000 men to camp next to the convention. Officially, he claimed that he had handed over control of his very large army to Gutierrez's new Minister of War. But the delegates were not reassured since the minister was José Isabel Robles, a villista. The brutal display of power drove most of the independents, including Obregón, to support Carranza. Why did Obregón join Carranza? Even though he was likely risking his life since he would be executed if Villa won, Obregón had little choice since he had nothing in common with Villa, suspected that Villa would still prefer to see him 6 feet underground, and most of his generals would have never agreed to join Villa. Also, he had no other options. Zapata was suspicious of pro-capitalist revolutionaries like Obregón, since he knew that they were merely allies of convenience who wanted to organize the peasants' land so that farming could be modernized. To be fair, Zapata realized that cash crops were needed to raise revenue, to care for the sick, build schools, and fund armies for self-defense, but the needs of the local peasants, not distant owners, must always be dominant. Since the Americans had agreed to pull out of Veracruz, Carranza abandoned Mexico City for Veracruz, which offered an excellent base with customs revenue and a port. When American forces had seized Veracruz, they had impounded all weapons shipments that arrived while they were there, and those weapons were transferred to the Carrancistas, the followers of Carranza. Once Carranza and his men left Mexico City, Zapata's people came in, poor and awestruck by the city. Zapata hated the city, symbol of bosses and government authority, but he knew that he had to stay long enough to enforce rural reform. Zapata's followers wanted only their simple rural life, traditional worship, and freedom from overseers where the villages ruled themselves. An experienced revolutionary leader by that time, Zapata was aware that his ideas were not universally accepted in the rest of Mexico, and an alliance with Villa would be valuable, but difficult to arrange. Although Villa and Zapata appeared to be natural allies on the surface, Villa had attracted more intellectuals who focused on political and educational reforms, rather than a revolutionary redistribution of land that threatened to destroy the economy. In particular, Villa's need for a modern army meant that he required a functioning economy to pay for it, while Villa's peasant army was constantly underfunded. In addition, Villa and his generals enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle, while the top Zapatista leaders continued to live humbly. When the two men finally met on December 4th, the contrast between the two groups was immediately clear. Villa's men looked like professional soldiers, while Zapata's men were badly armed peasants. It took some time to break the ice, but they eventually discovered that they shared a mutual hatred of politicians, Carranza in particular. They agreed that the government would have to give them autonomy in their respective territories and that they would not interfere in how the government handled foreign policy and other states where they had no influence. It was a relatively brief meeting, and the two men avoided specifics on land reform, probably realizing that it would simply lead to trouble. Refusing to acknowledge Villa as the overall leader of the revolution, Zapata would only agree that Villa would operate in the north and Zapata would operate in the south, not exactly a firm foundation for an alliance. 2 days later, the two men led 35,000 villistas and 20,000 zapatistas in a parade through the city. Although Guterres was the nominal president, Villa decided to sit in the presidential chair and convinced a visibly uncomfortable Zapata to sit next to him while posing for a picture. When the picture was printed in foreign newspapers, people naturally believed that Villa was the head of Mexico. However, Villa made no effort to schedule another meeting with Zapata, who promptly left the city, which he despised, to return home. The loathing was mutual, since the residents of Mexico City never understood Zapata's love of the land and fixation on preserving villages against the more efficient haciendas, which produced goods that were consumed in Mexico City. The moment when the two men led their armies through Mexico City was the height of their respective power, since the two of them were unwilling to make the commitment to take part in the governing of the nation or even agree on a specific power-sharing agreement other than stay out of each other's territory. They simply wanted to be left alone, but did not realize that a national government actually needed to rule over the entire nation, not just parts of it. They probably would have been unstoppable if they had worked together. Villa had a powerful army, but no objectives, while Zapata had a plan, but a peasant army. Unlike the Zapatistas and the Villistas, the Carrancistas had one key advantage. They were not tied to any one single region, which made it a truly national army. Furthermore, Carranza controlled areas like oil-producing Tampico, henequen-producing Yucatan, and coffee-producing Chiapas. Those areas had not been damaged by the fighting, and their products could be exported through Veracruz, providing customs revenue to pay for the army. Left alone in Mexico City, Villa's army demonstrated that it was not as professional as it appeared. Hundreds of people were killed as Villa's men looted and settled old scores, while thousands of women were raped. Some of the executed were followers of Heurta, but many were members of other revolutionary factions, including Zapatas. The chaos cost Villa the support of the middle class and foreigners, as well as revealed that many of the former bandits in his army had only remained under control when there was a clear enemy. The rampant lawlessness ended the illusion of Guterres as an independent ruler of Mexico. Moreover, Villa lacked the subtlety to rule as the power behind the throne and repeatedly mocked President Guterres in public, even though Guterres felt that he had actually been elected president and intended to govern as president. In return, Guterres began to conspire against Villa with independent members of the convention who had joined Carranza and Obregon. When he had sufficient evidence, Villa ordered Guterres' execution, but he told General Jose Robles, Minister of War in the new government, who gave Guterres enough warning that he was able to rally his supporters and escape the city on January 16th. He had been president for a little over 3 months. Guterres believed that he could actually create a third force separate from Villa and Carranza, but the generals who had joined Carranza knew that Guterres lacked the power to fight either of them, so they stayed where they were. When President Guterres tried to set up a new government in San Luis Potosi, the Cedillo family refused to officially support him, so he had to leave the state. Forces loyal to Guterres made a stand against Villista General Urbina, but their brutal defeat made it clear why people feared Villa. General Lucio Blanco realized the only third option was exile, and he made his way across the American border. Acknowledging that he lacked the power to oppose Villa on his own, Guterres submitted to Carranza's leadership. With Guterres gone, the national government needed a new president, and Villa ensured that the convention selected Roque González Garza, a Villista, to sit in the chair. Garza thanked Villa by making him head of the National Army. However, the sorry episode of the president fleeing the capital had ended the fiction that Villa served the national government. Furthermore, Garza found that the Zapatistas refused to acknowledge any central authority, so his attempts to act as a president irritated an already strained relationship between the Zapatistas and the Villistas, especially after Villa's reign of terror in Mexico City. The advisors who could have restrained Villa were spread out across the country. The revolution so far had involved fighting between loosely connected rebels and a federal government with a recognized leader, first Diaz, then Madero, and finally Huerta. After January 15, there was no federal government, so the fight was between two rebel factions, the villistas and the Carrancistas. Since neither Villa nor Carranza had a clear ideology or any real authority, much of Mexico chose to stay out of their civil war. Some of the local power brokers joined one side simply because local rivals backed the other side. To sum up, Carranza simply declared himself president of Mexico, but the other factions refused to recognize his authority, choosing Eulalio Guterres, a minor regional leader, instead. Carranza fled to Veracruz, but both his political career and life appeared over, except Villa had already tried to execute Obregón once, and he doubted that Guterres could restrain Villa from making another attempt, so he joined Carranza, setting the stage for a bloody civil war. I will discuss that civil war next episode. Thanks for listening.